Okay. And for our final presentation before our next break, we have Yigal Bloch, who will present a paper called Mixed Marriages and Priestly Privileges on the Treatment of the Problem of Foreign Wives by Ezra and Nehemiah. His research, he holds a doctorate in Jewish history and ancient Near Eastern studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research interests include ancient Near Eastern chronology, the political and social history of ancient Mesopotamia, Israel, and Judah, the literature of the Hebrew Bible, and ancient Semitic languages. He is currently working as a curator at the Bible Lens Museum in Jerusalem and has just finished teaching a course on Old and Middle Babylonian letters at the Bar Ilan University.
So, good afternoon, and I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for putting it together. In both the Jewish tradition and academic biblical scholarship, Ezra has been seen as the great lawgiver of the Persian period, a kind of second Moses for the rabbis, and a handy replacement for Moses as one who brought the Torah to Israel for the academics. Much of it has to do with the beginning and end of Ezra's career, as it is presented in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Artaxerxes script in Ezra 7, and the narrative of the public Torah reading in Nehemiah 8, where Ezra plays a central role. The other major deed ascribed to Ezra is his involvement in the crisis of mixed marriages narrated in Ezra chapters 9 and 10. But did Ezra accomplish anything in that crisis? According to the relevant chapters, after Ezra came with his companions to Jerusalem and delivered gifts to the temple, he learned that the Judeans had not separated from the neighboring peoples, but took women from those populations as wives. Ezra was stricken by grief, sat desolate, and toward the evening rose up in prayer that occupies almost all of Ezra 9. A practical solution was proposed by a certain Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, belonging to a group that apparently returned to Judah from Elam. Namely, a new covenant with God had to be established, the foreign women had to be expelled, and Ezra was the person to carry out this task. What happened next was a public assembly at which Ezra accused the Judeans of marrying foreign wives and demanded to expel them. The people proposed to appoint an official committee to examine the issue, which then submitted a report in 100 days. But what happened next? The report of the committee's findings occupies the remainder of Ezra chapter 10. It begins with a list of the members of the high priestly family, sons of Jeshua, son of Jotzadak, and his brothers, who took foreign wives, noting that the said men pledged to expel those wives and to deliver a guilt offering of a ram to the temple. The following text merely lists other trespassers, lower-rank priests than Levites and common Israelites, and ends with a summary in Ezra 10:44. No action or pledge is reported for all those individuals. So, were the foreign women expelled or not? This remains unclear, at least in the Masoretic version of Ezra and Nehemiah. In the Septuagint, in 1 Ezra 9:36, the postscript to the list ends with a remark that those who had married foreign women, quote, put them away with their children, unquote, but that is probably just a harmonistic interpretation of Hebrew vayasimu banim in the Masoretic text of Ezra 10:44. If we turn to the narrative of Nehemiah, the other major protagonist of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find a somewhat similar situation. Nehemiah's struggle against mixed marriages is mentioned toward the end of the first-person account of his activities, known as the Nehemiah Memoir. The relevant episode appears in Nehemiah 13. The chapter is a kind of postscript to the memoir, speaking of Nehemiah's activities in Jerusalem in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, or shortly afterwards, after he had paid a visit to the Persian king. The king here is certainly Artaxerxes I, and so the year is 433 or a bit later. Nehemiah finds out that some Judeans had married Ashdodite, Ammonite, and Moabite women, then censures, punishes, and admonishes them, but dissolution of their marriages is not mentioned. The only person who suffers a long-term punishment is the son of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest. Well, the Hebrew text is here ambiguous on whether the high priest is Joiada or Eliashib. But even this man is driven away by Nehemiah, instead of having to drive away his wife. So, what is happening here? Why does a long-term expulsion of either the foreign wives or their Judean husbands, actual or at least pledged, pertain only to members of the high priestly family? I think the answer is connected to the official functions granted to Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah is mentioned in his memoir in Nehemiah chapter 5 as the provincial governor of Judah. As such, he would be responsible for the administration of the province, including taxation and corvée labor, and also for matters related to the Jerusalem temple. As for Ezra, he apparently received the sweeping authority from King Artaxerxes, as detailed in Artaxerxes' script in Ezra 7. But here, of course, the matter is more complicated. In the early 20th century, it had been commonly accepted that the Aramaic sections of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah quote authentic documents from the Achaemenid royal chancellery. Yet, in the wake of the studies by Nestor Grabe, Dirk Schwiderski, and specifically on Ezra 7 by Sebastian Gretz, this view can no longer be maintained. Looking just at the text shown on the screen in translation, one can notice that the Achaemenid royal treasury allegedly underwrote the expenses of the Jerusalem temple up to 100 talents of silver. That is 29% of the total revenue of the 5th satrapy Trans-Euphratine, according to Herodotus, Histories 391. Such a sum in itself is quite unreasonable. But then, the next expense mentioned in Ezra 7:22 is 100 cores of wheat as the upper limit on the royal treasury's expense for that commodity. It is difficult to come up with an estimate of how much wheat would cost in the 5th century BCE because almost all the data on community prices come from Babylonia, where wheat was rare and barley was the common staple. Nonetheless, a land sale stone stele kuduru from the reign of Nabu-Mukinapli of Babylon, of the mid-10th century BCE, specifies that part of the price for 2 parcels of land was paid in various commodities. Part of the payment was 5 cores of wheat valued at 20 shekels of silver, and another part was 44 cores of barley valued at 98 shekels of silver. The stele was published by Michaela Vesely back in 2010. This yields the price of 2.2 silver shekels per 1 core of barley, 180 liters, and 4 silver shekels per 1 core of wheat, almost double. As observed by Michael Yursa in his article of 2015 on market performance and market integration in Babylonia, the Nabu-Mukinapli Kuduru precedes the large-scale monetization of Babylonian economy that took place in what is called the long 6th century. That monetization resulted in a considerable reduction of barley prices mentioned in silver. But one must note that in the late reign of Darius I, so in the 5th century, from his 20th year onward, the barley prices started to rise again. Thus, for the last 16 years of Darius' reign, again 5th century, the attested barley prices range from 3 to 10 silver shekels per 1 core, as shown by Yursa in AOIT 377. But, even if we take the maximum prices and just the wheat price accordingly, we would arrive at around 18 silver shekels per 1 core of wheat in Babylonia in the 5th century BCE. Notably, in the Levant, where wheat was the main crop, the price would probably be lower, but for the sake of the argument, let's stick with a higher price. In this case, 100 cores of wheat would cost around 1800 shekels or 30 minas of silver. That's half a talent. The addition of a whopping 0.5% to the sum of 100 talents specified just before in Ezra 7:22. Already the disproportional relation between the two sums suggests that the list is artificial and formulaic and does not reflect any genuine authorization for the royal treasury. The scope of Ezra's powers in the Artaxerxes script is also clearly exaggerated. It would be pointless for the Persian king to grant Ezra authority over all the people in Trans-Euphratine, of whom the Judeans were a tiny minority. In her analysis of the terms Data di Elahah and Data di Malka in Ezra 7, Lisbeth Fried pointed out, in an official context, quote, the word data never implies anything more than an ad hoc royal or satrapal decree, unquote. Whereas in the context of God's law, quote, again, the data of Ezra's God is the wisdom that Ezra possesses, and vice versa, unquote. Fried's argument was directed against the understanding of Ezra's mission as having anything to do with promulgation of a written code of laws attributed to Moses. Of course, this does not mean that there were no authoritative writings later compiled into what we know as the Pentateuch. Most, if not all, of the major sources of the Pentateuch were probably extant by the mid-5th century BCE. But the concept of the Torah, as a clearly determined and publicly known document, apparently did not yet exist when Ezra came to Jerusalem. So, while Ezra could use his wisdom to declare God's law in Judah, he would be unable to do so across the entire Trans-Euphratine, unless endowed by the king with satrapal powers, which was obviously not the case. This is another indication of the scope of Ezra's authority in the Artaxerxes script. Another indication that the scope of Ezra's authority in the Artaxerxes script is a literary embellishment, similar to the sum of 100 talents of silver a couple of verses before. Yet another embellishment is the comprehensive exemption of all the servants of the Jerusalem temple from taxes and service duties in Ezra 7:24. The Aramaic terms mindab, lo, vehalach in this verse are translated by Friedel in her commentary on Ezra as rent, tribute, and corvée. And of course they correspond to Akkadian mandatu, biltu, and ilku. The first two of these terms refer to payments in kind or in silver, while the last one originally signified the service duty, but eventually this duty could also be replaced with a payment. In her book, The Priest and the Great King of 2004, Lisbeth Fried argued convincingly that the Achaemenid Empire progressively encroached on the privileges that had been earlier enjoyed by the temples and their servants across the Near East. And we heard more on this today. Against this background, a blank exemption to the servants of the Jerusalem temple would be extremely unlikely. Still, some of the former temple privileges were retained by some temple priests. Thus, for example, Caroline Wertzehers showed that the temple emperors, Eribiti of Ezida in Borsippa, were exempt from performing in-person corvée duty in Elam in the reigns of Darius I and Xerxes. Another example is the trilingual inscription from Xanthos, about which we heard yesterday, and it is dated to year 1 of Artaxerxes IV, namely Arses, so the year is 337 BCE. The text is inscribed on 3 sides of a limestone stele found in the vicinity of Xanthos, the capital of Lycia in Asia Minor. The text is inscribed, as we saw, in 3 languages, Aramaic, Greek, and Lycian, and we can see the Aramaic text on the screen. Now, it mentions a decision by Pixoderos, son of Hekatomnos, the satrap of Caria and Lycia, who, in response to a petition from the people of Arna, the Lycian name of Xanthos, authorized the establishment of a cult for Kandawats, the god of the Carian city of Kaunos. A certain Simia, son of Kodorasi, was appointed the god's priest, and his property was made exempt, apparently from taxation and service duty. In the Greek text of the inscription, we can see the same decision with more detail. For example, it is said here that the new cult was dedicated not only to the Kaunian king, which is the meaning of Kandawats in Lycian, but also to the god Archesimas. The Greek text also mentions that not only Simias, but his nearest kin, and Eutatos, were to function as the priest for all time, and were granted exemption from public burdens, atelia, on their property, thus in lines 10 and 11. Fried observed that the new cult was instituted not on the satrap's initiative, but on that of the local population of Xanthos, and the satrap merely approved their selection of the priest and his exemption from public duties. Still, the exemption was granted to the priest and to his descendants. In Caria proper, in the necropolis of Lagina, another Greek inscription was found dated to the mid-4th century BC, with the rule of the satrap Mausolus, another Hecatomnid and an elder brother of Pixoderos. According to this text, a certain Skoaranos and his wife donated a plot of wooded land to the gods Apollo and Artemis, and in return, the person selected to look after Skoranos' tomb was to be exempt from all the taxes, except the royal ones. Here we have another example of a cult, this time a funeral cult, whose officiating servant was granted at least a partial tax exemption. Based on these parallels, it seems reasonable to suggest that in the Jerusalem temple also some temple servants would be exempt from at least some taxes and service duties. This may have been the historical basis for the much expanded and embellished tax exemption in the biblical text of the Artaxerxes script. The most reasonable persons to enjoy an actual rather than literary tax and service exemption in Jerusalem would be the high priest and his sons and brothers, or at least is intended here in the office. A possible difficulty for this proposal is presented by the list of the builders of Jerusalem's city wall in Nehemiah chapter 3. This list begins with the high priest Eliashiv and his brothers, as we can see on the screen. Elizabeth Fried, in her article in Trans-Euphratean of 2018, argued that the construction was carried out with corvée labor. Yet, at least some people in Judah were able to avoid taking part in the wall's construction, as did the nobles Adirehem of Tekoa in Nehemiah 3 verse 5. And still, Eliashib and his brothers did not avoid the task. Perhaps they took part in building their section of the wall not in fulfillment of a corvée duty, but rather perceiving this task as part of their public obligation toward the well-being and prestige of their community or city. A similar motivation has been recently suggested by Shai Gordon for some Babylonian urban magnates' participation in public works in Elam, even though the people involved were rich enough to hire substitutes. One should know that the section of the wall assigned to Eliashib and his brothers contained the sheep gate and the tower of Hananel. Based on Zechariah chapter 14, this tower can be located in the northern wall of Jerusalem, close to the temple, and thus would be a prestigious location. Assuming that the high priest and his immediate family were exempt from at least some duties imposed on other Judeans, what would be the conditions for this exemption? In Babylonia, the term for exemption of the people of temple cities from state service was kidino, about which we have just heard from Celine. Originally, this term referred to a divine emblem placed in the city gate, but it also came to mean a general protection afforded by a deity to the residents of his or her temple city. This term's history was served by Hanoch Reviv in 1988 and Kristen Kleber in 2021, who demonstrated that by the Neo Babylonian and the Achaemenid periods, the term lost its original meaning and came to signify a relation of protection and dependence between a patron and the client's duties arising from such dependence. And as we have just heard, this term was also later transferred into the sphere of human-divine relations. Yet, in the Neo-Assyrian period, the term kidino was still used with its original meaning. Important information on the conditions of the tax and service exemptions it signified can be found in the letter of the people of Babylon to Ashurbanipal, SAA 18,158. As we can see from this letter, it speaks of Babylonians who married women from Elam, from Tabal, and from some Ahlamite, that is Aramean populations. The letter asks the Assyrian king who at the time ruled over Babylon that the privileged status here denoted by the abstract noun kidinutu be granted to those women as well. This means that such a status would not be automatically bestowed on women of non-Babylonian origin, and presumably neither on their offspring. Well, the women would not be called up for service anyway. Of course, we are dealing here with the 7th century BC, well before the Achaemenid period. Yet, in a note published in Nabu in 2013, Michael Yursa called attention to the Neo-Babylonian tablet PTS 2253, which is a copy of an inscription of Ashur-etel-Ilani, king of Assyria, the successor of Ashurbanipal. The inscription mentioned dedication of a table of precious wood to Marduk, and a subscript to the tablet records allocation of offering foodstuffs to Nadin, son of Belechei Kisha, a scribe active in the Yana temple in Uruk in the reign of Cambyses. This means that the tablet was copied in Cambyses' reign, more precisely in his 3rd year, 527 BCE. Yursa suggested that the Urukian scribe produced this copy in the framework of Cambyses' activity in collecting the inscriptions of earlier kings, which was intended to place King Cambyses in the tradition of legitimate Babylonian kingship. The interest on the part of a Persian king in local Babylonian traditions could also contribute to preservation of the earlier conditions for privileges still left to the Babylonian priesthood, especially as those conditions limited the access to the privileges, thus serving the Persian crown's interests. If we assume that similarly to Babylonia, the tax and service exemptions enjoyed by the members of the high priestly family in Jerusalem were conditioned on marriage within the local community centered on the temple, then we can understand why marriages to foreign women threatened specifically the members of the high priestly family. Ezra and Nehemiah probably did not hold the state authority enabling them to annul anyone's marriage, but they could revoke the privileges of those members of the high priestly family who took foreign wives. I suggest that this was the reason why negative actions arising from mixed marriages are mentioned in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah only with regard to the members of the high priestly family. Thank you.
Thank you, Yigal. Do we have questions for Yigal?
Well, I'm standing between people and their lunch, so. Yes.
Pass the microphone.
I was just meaning to. It was very, very interesting and with a lot of new information for me. The connections here. So thank you very much, Yigal. I just wanted to say something about the data that you mentioned, and that is eventually in Old Persian. This is a PPP formation that means specifically that which is given, and can mean a variety of things. That's the fact that people interpret it in a specific light does not mean that other possibilities are improbable, because in Persian in general it was used for various things, from announcements to law to various things.
Yes, yeah. In fact, Chris Taplin has an Chris Taplin has a long article published in 2015 arguing that although data in kind of official context was a specific announcement by a specific official, it acquired some kind of precedent force and then moved to becoming a law. But well, that's a separate question of how long it took and how it happened. So, yes.
pass the microphone back behind you. Oh. Yeah. Thank you.
It's not a question, just a note, a comment. In Nehemiah, the reform of expelling the foreign women, there are some scholars that think that verses 28 and 29 regarding the priestly marriage are secondary, because there's a tension. The main text describe marrying Asdodite women, and here it's marrying Samaritan women, and there are another problems in this unit, and there are some scholars that suggest that originally this text was not concerning the priestly, but all the Judeans, and the priestly context is secondary.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. That takes us into the compositional and redactional history of Nehemiah 13, which is a whole different topic. But thank you for the remark.
Yes.
Yes.
If they're married to the
Yes.
women out of the context of priestly.
Yeah. Well, I think that for the author of Nehemiah, the Samaritans would be foreigners just the same as the Ashdodites, but it's a different discussion.
Other questions? Everybody's eager to go to lunch. We've moved the whole schedule by 15 minutes, so we have some time. All right. No more questions.